So it's been a little over 2 years since I first talked about Yokai Watch, and it's been almost a year since its American debut, and things haven't been terribly rosy in the level 5 camp as of late. What started as the arrival of a smash hit from Japan being given a huge media push from the powerhouse triple threat of Nintendo, Hasbro, and Disney has turned into a shell of its former self in the US, any merchandise being quietly spirited away to the furthest reaches of the store to make room for newer, more popular brands. The defined Pokemon killer, about a kid and his special watch that lets him communicate with ghosts and spirits, actually got off to a promising start, with the first game nearly doubling the numbers from its domestic Japanese launch by raking in a respectable 1.1 million units sold in foreign markets. Medals were selling decently as well, even if other merchandise was sluggish, and things seemed to be okay for the new brand. But then the sequel games happened. And Pokemon Sun and Moon happened. The second games in the series, which were still split into 2 games for their foreign release, making the Pokemon comparison all but unavoidable, barely scraped by 1/4 the foreign sales of the first game, barely breaking 160,000 units in America, while the combination of Pokemon Go and Generation 7 delivered a massive 1-2 punch to remind everybody who's still the top dog in town. Keep in mind, this is the game that sold nearly 6 million units in its native Japan, causing all of the other games and companies out there to take notice and reorganize, and it has barely left a blip in foreign markets. The sequel also took a critical thrashing, as its glacial pace convinced many reviewers that the game had failed to introduce any new or interesting features. Now, while the game does introduce many new and interesting ideas, such as poking and trading, I can't argue about just how slowly it crawls along compared to the original, or, in fact, any game in its genre, as you don't get much of anything new until you are between 8 and 11 hours into the game. As a result, announcements on anything yokai have slowed to a trickle, with a light announcement of Yokai Watch 2's Emerald version, Shinuchi, being slated for a fall release as Psychic Specters, Hasbro having only a trifle of new products to show at Toy Fair, many of which are just updated versions of toys that have been flooding my local Dollar Tree, and some images of Season 3 without many concrete details, leaving the fate of Yokai Watch 3, a game designed to deliberately appeal to American audiences, up in the air as the companies involved reevaluate their situation. It has also brought into question a lot of brands that have imitated Yokai Watch as to whether or not their investments could successfully make a splash overseas. There will be some fallout as a result of Yokai Watch, and it will be interesting to see how such brands do in a worldwide market that met Yokai Watch with mostly a shrug. I mean, in some cases, Pokemon reevaluating itself with the lessons learned from Yokai Watch has created its most interesting generation in years, but others that copy only the surface elements like Atmon might find trouble in foreign markets. In my original video about Yokai Watch, when addressing whether or not it can match Pokemon's popularity worldwide, my answer was a very hard no, which I explained in that video, but for those of you who haven't seen that video, here's the short version. Yokai Watch is very, very Japanese. It's full of Japanese folklore, Japanese jokes, and Japanese puns, a lot of which don't translate very well into other languages. Pokemon did not suffer from these same constraints, as one could appreciate the product even if they were ignorant of the culture it came from. Take Gyarados, for example. While it is based on an old fable about a fish that managed to swim to the top of a waterfall and became a dragon, the idea of a pathetic little fish turning into a giant scary sea monster is funny in any language. Whereas Yokai Watch has Mount Fuji dressed as a sumo wrestler and a guy who carries his tongue around in a bucket. Yep, that's pretty Japanese, alright. Now, don't get me wrong, Yokai Watch was always going to have a decent audience in America. In fact, this video was inspired largely by the extra credits video titled Localize Everything. Nintendo could have easily counted on 3 groups who would buy the game in America. People who are fans of Level 5, people who are fans of quirky Japanese culture, and people who are fans of monster games. As you have probably gathered by now, I fit into 2 of those categories. I may have been critical of Yokai Watch, but I was always going to buy it. Now, would Yokai Watch have done as well as it did without that big marketing push? Probably not, but I can pretty much guarantee you that anybody outside of Japan who bought a copy of Yokai Watch 2 will probably fall into one of those 3 categories. And there is still a lot of fascinating lore in the Japanese folklore of the games, hence why I put out a small series called The Story Behind the Yokai to help people learn about what was lost in translation. While it may not have been colossal in size, Yokai Watch was always going to have a decent following outside of Japan, and even a basic release on the eShop would have satisfied a lot of people. But thanks to its status as the next big thing in the eyes of the Reginator and others, this series was instead given a huge marketing push with awkward commercials and extended portions of Nintendo Directs. something that actually turned a lot of players off of the franchise, along with the whole Pokemon killer backwash that Nintendo was doing nothing to quell. Hasbro and Disney had their little parts to play in this mess as well, and it goes into one of several things I noticed that harmed the brand's chances worldwide. Now, to clarify, before I get into anything deep here, most of what I'm going to talk about is stuff that I have never touched on before in an effort to keep things fresh. Problem number 1, Hasbro casting aside what was already there. By far the biggest success Yokai Watch found in Japan was the sale of the medals, which sold in the tens of millions and became harder to find than an NES classic on Christmas Eve. There were a number of other toys and plush and model kits, and pretty much anything you could imagine had the likes of Jibanyan, Whisper, and Koma-san plastered all over them. And lots of fans all over the world had obtained the Japanese medals and watches and toys for themselves, amassing small collections in anticipation of the inevitable worldwide release. So in comes Hasbro, master toy licensee for North America, and they threw all of it out. Because sometimes it seems like Hasbro just can't help themselves. They look at a successful brand and go, hey, you know that thing that sold so well in its native country? Let's change all of it. Surely that will work. One of the results of this was moving the medals' dot tracks from the center to the left, a move made not to separate their medals from Bandai's Japanese ones, as the hardware is otherwise exactly the same, but so the Model Zero version could house a little microglyph animation gimmick, which is something that, to my understanding, was planned from the start. Coupled with Yokai Watch 1 only being able to use Hasbro's medals, and a lot of the people who were hoping for the chance to use the medals they already had wound up disappointed. Was there genuine concern from Hasbro that parents would buy the Japanese watches for their kids instead? I mean, what reason did the parents have to buy the English one, aside from the fact that it speaks English rather than some kooky language their kid doesn't understand? Oh, I guess that might be a reason. Add in the fact that the names of the characters were removed from the medals to quote-unquote add to the magic of discovery when putting the medals into the watch, an obvious spin tactic when it was likely due to the multilingual release, as well as eliminating the flashlight from the original watch in a money-saving tactic, despite me being able to get an LED desk lamp at my local dollar store which is good enough for me to light something for film, and America wound up with a bit of a subpar release. I mean, I guess the plush toys are pretty nice, but I'm not lying when I say I got this Shogunyan at Dollar Tree. And we didn't even get the Fumi watch, which had already been out in Japan for some time before Hasbro's launch of their own products, which makes me wonder why they didn't have their own version ready so that they didn't have to reprint a bunch of the old medals like Bandai had to upon rectifying the mistake of not releasing it initially. Whether this is due to a logistical error and Hasbro was unaware of the Fumi watch's existence, or if it was Hasbro's archaic gender stereotypes acting up again, I cannot say. The disaster that was the Yokai Watch trading card game, where the original game, which already had an English version by the way, was cast aside in favor of a hastily cobbled together heap which could not have been any fun for the people making it and came out in such a state that should be seen as inexcusable for the company in charge of Magic the Gathering and Duel Masters, certainly didn't help. Part of this stems from the fact that Hasbro really doesn't like investing in a niche franchise, as seen with the slow decline of Kaijudo and their localization of Wii-Cross, and by that I mean complete lack thereof. Now, some good did come out of it. We were able to get the experience of using the medals in the game, and Nintendo did eventually ameliorate some problems by letting you scan Japanese medals into Yokai Watch 2, but by then the damage was already done. Once the Model Zero, along with its microglyph gimmick that stripped away the price advantage the first watch had, and wouldn't recite the names of the character in the first generation of medals, which, need I remind you, had no names printed on them so you could experience the magic of discovery, came out, it was pretty much over for the merchandise side of things. We still have no word on any plans for the Fumi, U, Dream, or Black watches, especially as those would have pushed the price points even higher with their more sophisticated designs. It's probably safe to say that as far as toys are concerned, Yokai Watch is probably through outside of Japan.
Hello, this is American Yokai. Nanka Yokai? American Yokai!
Even if Hasbro offers new product for sale, who knows whether any stores will order them or not. This would likely put a damper on plans to release Yokai Watch 3 or any of the spin-off games worldwide as well, since there would be no merch support in the form of scannable or chip-loaded medals, an essential part of Yokai Watch 3, unless Nintendo was willing to gamble on leaning on the Japanese releases.
Obaga!
Problem number 2, how Disney handled the dub. Now, I've already mentioned the quality of the voice casting before and how one particularly spot-on casting decision cast a huge shadow over the mediocre performances going on elsewhere, but that was actually the least of the dub's problems. First, the dub was pulled into a sort of tug-of-war between the localization efforts of the network who wanted a more American-friendly adaptation and the fans of the Japanese original who fought for purity, and nowhere is this more obvious than the theme song, where you get the choice between Swampy Marsh's twangy, tired-sounding nonsense, "They'll trip you up, give you a flat tire," and the dub team's best attempt to directly translate the original Japanese opening, Gara Gara Po. There's more yokai than titties in Idaho, like cheese squeak in his po-po. Man, it's like Halle Berry and Catwoman. You can tell they're trying their hardest, but they've been given nothing to work with. And normally Swampy's better than this. What happened? This was later compounded by the second version of the ending song, Dan Dan Dooey Zuba, lacking the charisma and energy of the original. The censorship of certain scenes also created a bit of a stir on social media, where people on Facebook who otherwise hadn't heard of Yokai Watch had a nice giggle at the old-fashioned adaptation trope where characters in perfectly fine bathing suits were covered up and altered. Don't take your kids to the pool, they might see people in bathing suits. Kinda hilarious, seeing as it was put out on a channel run by a company who famously got its groove back with characters dressed like this. On that subject, Yokai Watch launched on Disney XD, a premium cable network where Disney throws the shows it wants to die. I mean, just look at what happened to Gravity Falls numbers when it was moved off the main Disney network. It's kinda difficult for a franchise to become the next big thing when it's squirreled away on a channel that only half of the people who even have cable can even watch. I mean, I get it, it's kinda difficult to get your name out there in this day and age of streaming, but that really emphasizes the need to adapt to the changing markets. Lots of channels and shows have been putting their archives in easily findable places. Just look at everything Aldi is doing on YouTube, or how Nick Jr. maintains its UK channel, giving backlogs of episodes both on YouTube as well as its own easy-access websites and apps that let you browse hours of free, bingeable backlogs of their shows on demand versus Yokai Watch, whose policy was only to let you watch one new episode at a time per week in an age where people can pick up nearly any other show and watch for hours. It's an age where people can find out about a show or concept and then immerse themselves in them by watching the backlogs on Crunchyroll or YouTube, and I'm not sure if Yokai Watch has a similar way to get at a backlog of episodes, outside of questionable websites hosting the original Japanese episodes, and nothing hurts a dub's, especially a mediocre dub's, reputation like getting compared to the original. Just ask 4Kids. Yo! Don't give it up, Lupe! Don't give it up, Solo! Don't give it up now, man! Don't give it up. And problem number 3, Nintendo being slightly annoying. Now, despite how I've been talking about the companies involved, Nintendo seems to be the least guilty party here. The game's translation and adaptation were largely faithful, plenty of copies were made available on release day, and nothing broke down or bugged out. As far as pulling their fair share, that share being the delivery of a good game adaptation, is concerned, Nintendo did a fine job compared to Hasbro and Disney. It's like LBX all over again, only perhaps less spectacularly bad. I can't say I'm entirely sure how things went behind the scenes and how much sway Nintendo asserted over Hasbro and Disney's decision-making, but they kind of did the best job on their part of the three of them. I mean, there were smaller players as well. Level 5 seemed to chronically not understand the situation they would find themselves in. And Viz certainly didn't help as the source behind the Pokemon killer notion. But the biggest players in this are still the three-pronged connected approach between game, show, and merchandise, all of which cannot really survive without the others. If Nintendo made any mistakes, it was pushing the game in directs and commercials to the point of nausea and being complicit in the works of other companies involved by restricting the game to Hasbro-only medals in the first game and okaying that Swampy Marsh theme. Oh, and maybe launching the same day as the new Call of Duty, which outsold it 300-1. So honestly, if the game series is to continue outside of Japan, the ball is largely in Nintendo's court, as they would probably have to go forward without the large amounts of merchandise support, seeing as most distributors are offloading it to my local discount and dollar stores. They are already slated to release Psychic Specters later this year, but most of the merchandise support for that game is already in circulation, and unless Psychic Specters manages quite the windfall and makes up all the ground lost by the double-gamed sequel, the chances for us to see Yokai Watch 3, Busters, or Sangokushi seem dismal at best. I mean, if a Yokai Watch 3 adaptation is in the works, releasing it on the e-store for diehards who have been buying up all the Japanese medals could turn a small profit, or at least recover the adaptation costs already sunk, if they have been sunk. Now, just to make myself perfectly clear, I like Yokai Watch. Do you really think I would have gone through all of the effort of making a series detailing the background of certain yokai if I did not have a level of affection for it? I like Yokai Watch 1 and how it bucks the industry trend of being sent out into a vast world to explore by suggesting that maybe there's plenty of adventure to be found in your own hometown, and I like how Yokai Watch 2 vastly increases the scale to the point where huge events from the first game are relegated to mere side quests in its sequel. And if Yokai Watch 3 ever hits stateside, I'll probably buy it. But the core problem really is that it just isn't the kind of series that holds a worldwide appeal. It doesn't really act as a good gateway into Japanese culture either, with a lot of its humor instead relying more on your ability to get the references, which most Japanese do and most non-Japanese do not. Yokai Watch was always going to face an uphill battle outside of its native Japan, something I don't think the companies involved in localizing it fully appreciated. It's why I dropped such a harsh statement at the end of my initial review, to serve as a warning to those companies to be a bit more careful, and even Level 5 has admitted to slumping sales in their own country. Hopefully the proper lessons can be taken from this, and whatever the next big thing to come out of Japan might be, will be treated with the care and respect that it properly deserves, which might be Snack World. Or it might not. I mean, it was clearly designed with more of a global audience in mind, what with how the main character is literally Finn from Adventure Time, but So that's sort of the state Yokai Watch is in. It could still hang on as a niche series outside of Japan, unless of course all remaining enthusiasm is crushed by the worldwide introduction of Inaho, a character that was found annoying even by the Japanese, the same people who, lest we forget, think of Tingle as high comedy. But that's just how the market is gone, and unless Psychic Specters manages some kind of miracle win against Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, then the fate of this series worldwide is largely sealed. Until next time, this is Kodak signing off.
He can talk to the spirits, he doesn't have to fear it, and they're always gonna hear it, cause you know he's got a Yokai Watch.
Hey, thanks for watching to the end. If you really liked what you saw, please consider subscribing and following me on Twitter, and if you really liked what you saw, consider supporting me on Patreon, full of exclusives, early access, and more.